The studio lights blazed down as the band wrapped up their opening number, and Jimmy Kimmel stepped onto the stage with his signature grin, tossing out quick-witted jokes to warm up the crowd. There was an excited buzz in the audience. Tonight's guest was none other than Tom Cruise, the Hollywood legend known for his thrilling stunts, intense interviews, and magnetic screen presence. As Jimmy teased the upcoming conversation with a few jabs about jumping on couches and scaling buildings, the crowd laughed along, unaware of what was about to unfold. Then, with polished charm and practiced flair, Jimmy announced Tom's name. The applause erupted as Tom Cruise walked onto the stage, his posture confident, his smile tight and deliberate. He waved to the audience, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of defiance, a tension behind the charisma. As Tom sat down, he adjusted his jacket, briefly locking eyes with Jimmy. There was a flash of something unreadable, discomfort, perhaps, or restrained annoyance. Jimmy welcomed him warmly, but the edge in Tom's reply was subtle and sharp. "Thanks for having me," Tom said coolly, the words formal rather than friendly. Jimmy tried to keep the energy high, jumping right into the light banter. "So, Tom, any buildings left in the world you haven't tried to jump off yet?" he quipped, expecting a laugh. The audience chuckled, but Tom didn't. His jaw clenched slightly as he turned his head slowly toward the host. "Be careful, Jimmy," he said, voice low but unmistakably pointed. "Some jokes have consequences." The moment hung heavy in the air. The audience went quiet, sensing a shift. Jimmy raised an eyebrow, unsure if Tom was playing along or being serious. "Hey, come on," he said with a chuckle, "it's just a bit of fun." Tom didn't blink. "You think I risk my life for fun?" he asked. "You think I hang off jets or jump across canyons for entertainment?" "That's not a punchline, Jimmy. That's my life." The crowd grew restless, some murmuring nervously, others staring in stunned silence. Jimmy tried to pivot, to ease the tension, but the line had already been crossed. Tom leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but filled with steel. "I came here for a conversation, not to be reduced to a meme." Jimmy shifted in his chair, trying to recover from the sudden chill in the room. He forced a laugh, brushing off Tom's intense glare. All right, he said, raising his hands playfully. "Let's talk about your latest movie. Another big explosive blockbuster, or should we call it your latest vanity project?" The words were meant to be tongue-in-cheek, but the timing was off, and the delivery hit harder than intended. A ripple of gasps moved through the audience. Tom's expression didn't change for a moment. Then, very slowly, he smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives right before everything goes off the rails. Tom tilted his head slightly, locking his gaze on Jimmy. "Vanity project," he repeated softly, almost as if tasting the words. "You really want to go there?" Jimmy looked momentarily thrown off, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his cue cards. "I mean, come on, Tom, you're hanging off planes, riding motorcycles through fire. Isn't that just a little much?" Tom leaned back, his hands clasped together, the picture of restrained fury. "You think I do this for ego?" he said. "You think it's easy to risk your life take after take, year after year, while people like you sit back and laugh at it like it's some punchline?" Jimmy tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, I'm not laughing at you, man. I'm just saying it's intense." Tom leaned forward again, his tone sharp now. "You wouldn't survive one day on my set. Not one." The crowd was silent now, every eye on the two men. "You spend your nights under lights and punchlines. I spend mine preparing to do things that could kill me. And then I do them. Again and again." His voice never rose, but the weight of his words was undeniable. Jimmy attempted to pivot again, flipping through his notes for another question, but Tom cut in before he could speak. "You mock what you don't understand," he said firmly. "You wrap it in sarcasm, you sell it to the masses, and then you get praised for being clever." Jimmy looked stunned. For a moment, he had no comeback. The audience didn't know whether to laugh, applaud, or stay dead quiet. Tom's intensity wasn't the usual Hollywood promotion energy, it was raw, unscripted, and real. The silence between them stretched longer than what any producer would consider safe for live television. Jimmy glanced toward the control booth, silently begging for some kind of signal, some way out of the tense energy brewing right in front of him. But the cameras were rolling, and the audience was holding its collective breath. Still hoping to regain control, Jimmy chuckled nervously and decided to push forward, this time with a topic he thought would get a rise, or maybe a laugh. "So," he began, with a smirk, "do you still talk to aliens or just the Scientology hotline these days?" The crowd let out a stunned mix of gasps and laughs. A few people clapped uncertainly, but most looked around awkwardly, unsure if the joke had gone too far. Tom Cruise didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He sat upright in his chair, the playful air completely gone from his face. His voice was low and steady, but the anger underneath was unmistakable. "You think this is comedy?" he asked, almost whispering. "You're crossing the line, Jimmy." Jimmy tried to backpedal. "Come on, it's just a joke. We roast everyone who comes on the show." Tom's stare was unrelenting. "No, you mock everyone. There's a difference." The audience grew silent again. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but Tom cut him off. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for what I believe in. You sit there with your smirk and your cue cards and think that gives you the right to humiliate people." Jimmy raised his hands slightly, defensive but trying not to escalate. "It's part of the gig, man. You're Tom Cruise. You can take a few jokes." Tom stood up slowly, his presence suddenly towering. "I'm not here for this. I agreed to a conversation, not ridicule." The studio staff behind the cameras began to move subtly, sensing things were unraveling. Jimmy stayed seated, trying to look composed. "All right, let's just move on," he started, but Tom wasn't finished. "Mock my work, fine," he said sharply. "I've taken worse, but don't mock my faith. You don't know me, you don't know what I believe, and you have no right to sit there and turn it into a punchline for ratings." Now even the most die-hard fans in the crowd were silent. The cameras kept rolling, but it felt like the air had been sucked out of the studio. Jimmy's face was a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had pushed too far, and now it was clear there would be no easy way to recover. Tom looked out into the audience, scanning the rows of stunned faces. Then he turned back to Jimmy, voice calm but full of finality. "Say what you want behind my back. But if you're going to say it to my face, be ready to deal with the consequences." A low, murmuring tension buzzed through the studio as Tom Cruise stood towering over Jimmy Kimmel, his voice still echoing faintly in the sudden hush that followed his warning. Jimmy remained seated, eyes darting around nervously, his signature smirk now fully gone. He attempted a shrug, leaning back and forcing a laugh that came out strained and hollow. "Okay, buddy, take it easy. No need to go full mission, impossible on me." A few in the audience chuckled out of habit, but it sounded more like discomfort than amusement. Tom didn't even flinch. He stared down at Jimmy with a cold, unreadable expression. In the shadows near the edge of the stage, two security personnel began edging closer. They weren't rushing the scene, but their movement was intentional, slow, calculated, as if they weren't sure if they were interrupting a performance or stepping into an actual confrontation. Tom glanced at them, then looked back at Jimmy, clearly unfazed. He pointed subtly toward the cameras still rolling. "Don't hide behind a break," he said. "Don't try to edit this down to make yourself the hero." Jimmy was losing the room fast. His usual control, the comfort of the stage, the rhythm of laughter and applause, it had all been disrupted. He cleared his throat, looking off stage as the showrunner gestured for a commercial cut. "Let's take a quick break," Jimmy said, his voice slightly shaky. He turned to the camera with a rehearsed smile. "We'll be right back after these messages, folks." "No," Tom interrupted, still standing. "Let the cameras roll. Let everyone see the real you." The silence snapped back like a rubber band. The audience collectively tensed, and Jimmy blinked rapidly, unsure how to proceed. "Tom," he began, "this is my show." Tom stepped closer, eyes locked on Jimmy. "Then act like a host, not a bully." The accusation hit hard. Even Jimmy's loyal viewers in the audience looked taken aback. A woman in the second row visibly gasped, covering her mouth. Jimmy opened his mouth, searching for a clever retort, but none came. The cue cards in his hands looked suddenly useless, limp in his fingers. He tossed them onto the desk, frustrated. "All right, you know what? If you're going to turn this into a therapy session, maybe you should have stayed home." Tom's face barely moved, but his voice carried more weight than ever. "Maybe you should think about why this isn't the first time your jokes crossed a line." That line landed like a slap. The audience buzzed now, people murmuring to each other, some pulling out their phones despite being told not to. The moment was already bleeding off the stage and into the internet. Something real was happening, and everyone knew it. Jimmy shifted again, his posture more rigid now, lips pressed into a hard line. "You done?" he asked, voice tight. Tom didn't answer. He just stood there, letting the weight of everything linger, refusing to let Jimmy escape with a snide remark or a commercial fade-out. The confrontation had crossed from entertainment into something raw and human, and no one could look away. The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Tom Cruise stood tall, unwavering, while Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen, his normally confident demeanor visibly rattled. The cameras, still rolling, caught every micro-expression, every twitch of Jimmy's jaw, every subtle shift of Tom's gaze. Producers in the wings frantically signaled each other, unsure whether to step in or let the moment play out. One of the security staff took a hesitant step forward, only to pause as Tom held up a calm, commanding hand. "No need," he said without turning. "I'm leaving." There was a beat of silence before the audience realized what he'd said. The murmuring turned into whispers, some gasps, a few people even stood up, unsure of what they were witnessing. Jimmy straightened up, trying to regain even a sliver of control. "You don't have to leave, Tom. We can," but Tom had already turned. He adjusted his jacket with the same poise he used stepping out of explosions in his films. "You've made it clear what this is," he said over his shoulder. "I came here, thinking this was a platform. Turns out it was just another late-night trap." He walked past the desk slowly, brushing past a stunned production assistant who had no idea whether to stop him or get out of the way. Jimmy tried one last time, his voice rising slightly, desperation creeping in. "Tom, come on, man. Don't be that guy." Tom stopped mid-stride, back still turned, and responded without looking back. "And you, Jimmy, don't be the guy who pokes at people for a laugh and calls it a job." Gasps rippled through the crowd again as Tom continued walking. A few people in the audience stood and clapped hesitantly, unsure if it was appropriate. One man near the front shouted, "We love you, Tom." But even that felt out of place in the heavy silence. The backstage door swung open slowly as Tom approached, and just before stepping through, he paused, turned to face the audience, not Jimmy, and gave a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for your time," he said simply. Then he was gone. The door shut behind him with a soft but final thud. Jimmy stared at it for a moment, lips slightly parted, face pale under the bright lights. The cameras were still rolling. The audience waited for a joke, a line, a cue, but nothing came. Jimmy blinked a few times, leaned forward on his desk, and exhaled. "Well," he muttered with a dry chuckle, "that was different." A few laughs echoed back, weak and unsure. The usual rhythm was gone. The applause sign didn't light up. Somewhere backstage, the showrunner finally called for a commercial, and the feed slowly faded to black, but the moment wouldn't be forgotten. Social media was already exploding. Clips, quotes, hot takes, they were spreading like wildfire. People weren't just watching a talk show anymore. They had witnessed something raw, unscripted, and unfiltered. Tom Cruise hadn't stormed off in a rage, he had walked off in principle. And that made all the difference.